Ballard has been a useful writer for those stranded in suburban malaise, a fiction which illuminates the aggressively surreal, geographically alien ecosystem of the stagnant comfortability of market capitalist pillow-lined limbo. Stretching one's perception of the manicured suburban vistas, Ballard was the author who most captured the pathos of late 20th century modernity. Currently, the pathos of early 21st century postmodernity or post-postmodernity also invites Ballard as its most recognizable representative, due to both current modernity trying to invoke ideals of the late 20th, in repetition, out of habit, or as a reaction to subsequent failures of alternate ideals, and also due to Ballard casually anticipating many of these, seemingly. It is when I approach High Rise by Ben Wheatley, a filmmaker I do really like, I realize that Ballard's relevance is not so obvious. Maybe it was more so to Wheatley, whose initial vision, maybe wishful thinking on my part, was compromised in order to pitch and sell the film as a retro neo-70s satire of old cultural norms and predictable class warfare shenanigans, the reduction of class conflict or polemics surrounding them as the adjective shenanigans. But I am concerned that there is something fundamental about the 21st century or the human conditions we experience regardless of the era, which prevents the average reader of a Ballard text, presumably, from understanding its perpetual relevance to this century. In the 21st century, in the 2020s, our ideal home remains green suburbia. Not spaceships, not skyscraper complexes, not a low-gravity research station on Mars. We may as well be living in the Matrix, or more appropriately, a J.G. Ballard text. And Ballard is not indulging in symbolism or metaphor, or implying a sharper eye is required to observe, like a magnifying glass, the creepy crawlies underneath the freshly cut front lawns. Important to note about Ballard, as K-Punk writes, more interesting to recognize that the surface is already psychotic, that nothing lies beneath. I'll continue reading aloud his post from 2003. For Ballard, our assumption that cities are the future is an overhang from 19th century modernism, a notion as quaintly, endearingly outmoded as the prophecies of Jules Verne. With its concentrational density, its cramped streets, its unplanned sprawl, London is a horse-drawn Victorian relic. To Ballard's delight and to Ian Sinclair's horror, the future is not the city but the suburb. Unlike the old population centres, whether the ancient Roman shells or the relatively recent residual slag heaps of industrialism, the suburbs have been built with the car in mind. They thus give rise to the developments which Sinclair abhors but cannot help be fascinated by: ghostless out-of-town retail parks and shopping complexes, non-places accessible only by car, zones whose calculated, franchised anti-locality makes them resemble nothing so much as airports. Setting a Ballardian film in the past is reducing Ballard to an author of the 20th century, but then this can be forgiven due to the setting and publication date of the novel this film is adapting, 1975's High Rise. Now, reducing High Rise to a look back at the 70s, purely as surface aesthetic and postmodernity's ha-has, makes me lament more than just the apparent difficulty of conveying Ballard's relevance for a contemporary feature film work. It makes me question whether even those from earlier time periods who had witnessed the currently exalted 20th century time periods, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, even understand what their appeal is now, still. It isn't to jeer and feel excited at the possibility of playing dress-up, it is to use those frames of reference to expand and elasticize our own mental capacity for imagination and speculation. It isn't a surprise, or even a shame, or even unjustified, that many today, including or especially young people who never experienced it, look back upon the later 20th century with reverent, misty-eyed nostalgia. The world seemed smaller, more simple, more exciting, less complicated, but still thoroughly fun and familiar then. A film which truly wanted to display an act of 70s modernism for the contemporary world would probably be closer to one of David Cronenberg's earlier student films, or one of the dystopian / proto-cyberpunk films, THX, Terminal Man, Clockwork Orange, World on a Wire. Although those films, being futuristic mostly, makes it difficult to ascertain them as 70s modernism in a literal sense, although them as allegories for the present is thoroughly possible, their then present is thoroughly possible as well, obviously. that hypothetical film would also be doing so for the expansive imaginative possibilities to speculate upon what seemed or seems now exciting about experimental thought and open-ended thinking in the 1970s compared to the now. 70s weird, especially in the UK context. Consider the fonts, the music, the camera grain, the vision of the cosmos, the existential parameters. There is something so enviable about that brand of weird, and I suspect it has to do with that weird, symbiotic relationship with a stable, recognized, tangible consensus. That old post-war consensus in the UK. If there is consensus today, it is coming from a hyper-aggressive, parasocial marketplace of opinions and commercials online. Federal bodies cannot hope to compete culturally, corporations try their best, they have the most power, and certain social engineers might be pulling some strings, though even that might be wishful thinking compared with the brutish chaos. I suggest even those hypothetical social engineer puppeteers have a hard time controlling this world of today. Ballard's usefulness is twofold. Recognizing one's suburban surroundings as alien and inane, as exotic and unusual, and then firstly, after some wondrous shock, there is the validation of discomfort one has felt living in suburbs. It is thoroughly inhuman. It is not attuned to our species' genetic history. It doesn't reflect our prepared existential formal grammar. High Rise is barely a blip of what an effectively Ballardian film could or ought to accomplish. Truly, although its efforts at trying to realize a hyper 70s also fall somewhat flat. See, Barbarian Sound Studio was more effective in the regard I'm kind of considering, as was to some degree Beyond the Black Rainbow. High Rise is too much in capitulation to an insecure wackiness, dodges critiques of serious satire, neutralizes the judgments of critics via employing silliness, randomness, pandering, and evoking absurdity. A coward's way out, effectively. You can't attack me, I'm not being serious, this is just a silly farce, ha ha. A coward's way out, like I said. Commendable production, hack screenwriter, write it yourself Wheatley, but then it's your family life. Well, there's no guarantee that Wheatley is an original inventive writer either. A good director though, even of tepid misunderstandings of Ballard's genius. Sorry, Miss Jump, sincerely. If what I described High Rise being sounds appealing to one, give it a whirl. Actually, there is wholly a place for what I describe. I do like the film, taking it for what it is, and how it goes about doing that. Now, what it could have been, most would have liked to be, what it really ought to have been, it doesn't even really come anywhere close, although it helps paint in my mind a more vivid picture of that film which it could be, even if that film doesn't exist of yet. So insofar as it does that at all, I appreciate High Rise, very much so, yes. There is never any reason to de-alienate yourself from your surroundings. There is a peculiarity to even the most mundane arrangements of car parks, overpasses, public parks, and bus stops. Sometimes it is hard to appreciate. We assume that because we seek pleasure from food or intoxicants or from other people, that the absence of those things, or a slight melancholy at their absence ever, means a lack of love for life, although I'd sooner perceive it as a disappointment that not all of life's prospective pleasures are entirely easy or available or cost-free. Maybe we're all just neurons firing, though to that I say, identify the aesthetic which triggered those neurons, narrow down the qualities of the aesthetic. The beauty of that aesthetic cannot be explained in neurons, or quantifiable, or numeric terms, and that is what is so precisely magical. Well, magical? No. Unusual, interesting, alien, weird. And given the undesirability of predictability and normalcy, according to most human beings alive who would ever be surveyed, weird, for lack of a better word, more creative, imaginative, or weird word, is quite thoroughly and wholly good. High Rise is a success on its own terms, a failure in consideration of its potential, and valuable for illuminating more clearly than ever before that potential, even if it is via it having failed to some degree. Ben Wheatley, ride the Megalodon, my man. Use the profits of that film to fund the film this could have been, possibly.